Imagine an invisible hand sweeping across the entire globe. With a mere flick of its wrist, it's redrawing national borders, it's building towering megacities straight out of barren deserts, and it's literally toppling empires that have stood for centuries. It completely dictates the ebb and flow of global economics, the sheer desperation of soldiers on a battlefield, and, well, the daily habits of billions of people. Welcome to this explainer. Today we are undertaking a massive, cinematic deep dive into Daniel Yergin's Pulitzer Prize-winning masterpiece, The Prize, the epic quest for oil, money, and power. We're going to explore exactly how one single commodity became the ultimate prize of modern civilization, forging the world exactly as we know it today.
Okay, let's dive into this profoundly puzzling mystery. Why did a foul-smelling, sticky black liquid, something that just oozed out of the ground and was honestly considered a massive nuisance to early settlers, become the single most coveted asset in human history? I mean, think about it. Before 1859, if you found oil on your property, it was a disaster. It ruined your drinking water. Yet almost overnight, this raw, messy hydrocarbon became the ultimate currency of global power. And it wasn't just about lighting lamps or running a few early engines. No, it was about unleashing an unprecedented, mind-blowing concentration of energy that allowed humanity to literally push back the night and conquer the tyranny of distance.
Now, to truly grasp its scale, you can't just view petroleum as just another commodity like wheat or timber. It is the literal user manual of the 20th and 21st centuries. The story of oil is, quite frankly, the story of modern global capitalism coming into its own. And it's a very dark story, too. One inked in the blood of millions of lives lost in horrific global conflicts. It is the absolute foundation of incredible economic development and technological progress. Without understanding this black liquid, you simply cannot understand the geopolitical maneuverings, the rapid rise of sovereign wealth, or the dramatic shifts in world power that define our current era. It's the key to the whole shebang.
Act 1. The Architect of Chaos and Order. To really understand the modern oil industry, we have to travel back to the late 19th century Pennsylvania oil rush. And let me tell you, it was absolute bedlam. It was a chaotic scramble defined by the rule of capture. You had these wildcatters pumping as much flush production out of the ground as fast as humanly possible. This caused massive, unpredictable price swings, spectacular bankruptcies, and just total environmental devastation. The industry desperately needed an architect to bring some sort of order to this sheer chaos. And that architect arrived in the very unexpected form of a hyper-organized bookkeeper, John D. Rockefeller. Now there is a stark, almost jarring contrast within the man himself. On one hand, he was a product of a deeply religious puritanical upbringing. He was notoriously disciplined, lived super frugally, and kept meticulous ledger books, even tithing a portion of his meager early earnings to his Baptist church. But on the other hand, in the business arena, he executed his vision with a cold, ruthless, and almost terrifying precision. He didn't see himself as a tyrant, you know. He saw himself as an agent of rationalization, bringing necessary order to a completely irrational and wasteful market. But make no mistake, to his competitors, he was an absolute apex predator. To understand Rockefeller's true genius, we need to quickly break down the mechanics of the industry. In oil, there are two main arenas. First, you have upstream. This refers to the high-stakes gamble of exploration and drilling, the wildcatters sinking wells, relying on newly developed, almost experimental tools like torsion balances, magnetometers, and seismographs just to guess what lies beneath the surface. It's risky, it's chaotic, and it's totally boom or bust. Downstream, however, is the refining of that crude oil into usable products like kerosene and, crucially, the logistical nightmare of transporting it. While thousands of speculators gambled their life savings on the unpredictable upstream drilling, like playing the lottery, Rockefeller realized something brilliant. The real, sustainable power lay elsewhere.
Rockefeller recognized that owning the downstream, the refineries and the pipelines, was the key to the lock of the entire oil industry. Because honestly, it didn't matter who pulled the oil out of the ground if they couldn't process it or ship it. He essentially weaponized logistics. The most infamous example of his pretty dirty tactics was the South Improvement Company scandal. This was a covert, backroom alliance with major railroads. Rockefeller secured secret rebates. But wait, it wasn't just discounts on his own oil shipments. No, he secured actual kickbacks paid to him from the higher rates charged to his independent rival refiners. Imagine your competitor paying a shipping fee, and a cut of that fee goes directly into your pocket. It's insane. He systematically choked out the competition, forcing them to sell to him at absolute bargain prices or face total ruin. He literally controlled the industry's entire flow.
So the crucial takeaway here comes down to this staggering number, 90%. By 1879, the oil war was virtually over, and Standard Oil was utterly triumphant. Through a relentless campaign of consolidation, ruthless efficiency, and sheer logistical domination, Rockefeller's empire controlled 90% of America's refining capacity. 90%! And to bypass the railroads entirely, he had also built the world's first long-distance pipelines. The entire global market was now dominated by this original corporate giant. But as history shows us, Standard's overwhelming dominance couldn't last forever. The massive 1901 Spindletop discovery in Texas unleashed incredible new volumes of crude, shifting production away from Appalachia. But the real killing blow came from the government. In 1911, the Supreme Court ordered the dissolution of the Standard Oil Trust under antitrust laws. They shattered it into dozens of smaller companies, firms that, by the way, would eventually become giants like Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron. But here is the ultimate cinematic irony of Rockefeller's life. Because the combined value of these newly independent, rapidly growing companies absolutely soared as the automobile era began, well, the breakup actually made Rockefeller the wealthiest man in modern history. The government tried to take him down, and instead, they multiplied his fortune.
Act 2. Blood, Sand, and Octane. As the 20th century roared forward, kerosene lamps were slowly replaced by electric light bulbs. But the oil industry didn't die? No. It was completely reborn in the internal combustion engine. Oil evolved from a simple illuminant to the literal, throbbing blood of modern warfare. You see, the battlefields of the First and Second World Wars would not be determined by cavalry or infantry lines, but by mechanized logistics. It was a terrifying new era of total technological war, and this brilliantly illustrates one of the highest-stakes gambles in military history. On the eve of World War I, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, made the monumental, incredibly risky decision to switch the mighty British Navy from coal to oil. Now, traditional Welsh coal was domestic and totally secure, but it was incredibly bulky and required exhausting, backbreaking manual labor to load and stoke into the engines. Oil, on the other hand, had to be imported from vulnerable, far-off places like Persia, but it provided vastly superior speed, efficiency, and maneuverability. All the British naval programs between 1912 and 1914 were entirely oil-based. Churchill essentially bet the entire survival of the British Empire on a resource they did not even natively possess.
And that massive gamble paid off almost entirely because of the United States. To put that into perspective, by 1917, the U.S. accounted for a whopping 67% of total world oil output, 2/3 of the planet's oil. American oil became the absolutely critical lifeblood for the Allies. Meanwhile, Germany, which historically relied on its massive domestic coal reserves, faced a desperate and paralyzing shortage of petroleum. By October 1918, the German High Command estimated their mechanized land warfare and air operations would cease absolutely within 2 months, simply due to a lack of lubricants and fuel. The Allies literally floated to victory on a sea of oil. Fast forward a bit, and this desperate thirst for oil drove the catastrophic strategic errors of the Axis powers in World War II. From the very start, capturing the oil fields of Baku and the Caucasus was central to Adolf Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. He recognized, quite rightly, that oil was Germany's absolute weakest point. Halfway across the world, Imperial Japan faced a very similar existential crisis. When the United States placed an oil embargo on Japan following their invasion of Indochina, it effectively cut off their vital energy supplies overnight. Japan's desperate decision to strike Pearl Harbor was fundamentally an attempt to secure their flank so they could conquer the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. The relentless pursuit of petroleum literally dictated the geography and the pacing of the war.
Let's move deeper and see how this builds into the granular, highly technical nuances of warfare, what became known as the Octane Gap. It wasn't just about having fuel, it was about the actual quality of the fuel. The development of 100-octane aviation gas gave Allied fighter planes a critical, undeniable edge in speed and altitude during the Battle of Britain, completely outperforming the German planes that were running on lower octane. Germany, lacking raw crude, had to rely heavily on an incredibly complex, highly vulnerable network of synthetic fuel plants that turned coal into liquid. On May 12, 1944, a massive Allied bombing raid targeted these synthetic plants, notably the giant facility at Luna. When Nazi armaments minister Albert Speer saw the fiery destruction of that plant, he realized instantly the technological war was decisively, irreversibly lost.
Act 3, The Great Shift and the Desert Kings. The post-war era brought an absolutely insatiable global thirst for oil, fueling the rise of American car culture, massive highway systems, and rapid European reconstruction. In 1946, 77% of Europe's oil came from the Americas.
But by 1951, geologists and military strategists realized the real future lay in the massive untapped reserves of the Middle East. And this realization triggered a tectonic shift in geopolitical power, transitioning control from Western corporate boardrooms right into the palaces of sovereign producer nations. For decades, a cartel of Western oil companies, famously dubbed the Seven Sisters, had dominated global markets, operating in developing nations with near total impunity. But the producer nations began to fight back. The blueprint for this was actually drawn in 1938 when Mexico aggressively nationalized its oil fields to create Pemex, proving a sovereign state could absolutely take control. This spirit culminated in the 1960 formation of OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. By the 1971 Tehran Conference, these nations successfully forced the foreign oil companies to the table, completely seizing the power to dictate the price of their own resources. The era of the Desert Kings had officially arrived.
The true visceral shock of this massive power shift struck the world in 1973. During the Arab-Israeli War, Arab members of OPEC used oil as a literal political weapon, imposing an embargo that drastically cut production. The results were immediate and absolutely paralyzing. We're talking mile-long lines at gas stations, skyrocketing inflation, and total economic panic spreading across the Western world. To put it simply, every single recession since World War II had been preceded by a spike in oil prices, and this was the granddaddy of them all. It initiated the largest transfer of wealth in human history, redirecting absolute rivers of capital straight into the Middle East.
Out of this chaos emerged a totally new global financial architecture, the petrodollar. In the direct aftermath of the oil shocks, an arrangement was cemented where global oil exports would be priced and traded exclusively in United States dollars. So what does this actually mean? Well, it meant that every single nation on Earth needing to import energy also needed a constant, massive supply of U.S. currency. Oil officially became the absolute bedrock of the global financial system, tying the U.S. dollar intrinsically to the world's energy flow and granting the United States an unprecedented, almost unfair structural advantage in the global economy.
Conclusion: the Hydrocarbon Man.
As we reflect on this epic, centuries-long quest for this sticky black liquid, we really must step back and look at the deep philosophical implications of what Daniel Yergin uncovered. The story of oil is not just some dry history of tycoons like Rockefeller or wartime strategists or oil ministers. It is fundamentally a story about our very identity, our society, and the invisible infrastructure that makes modern human existence even possible. So, the crucial point is summarized perfectly by Yergin himself. Ours has become a hydrocarbon society, and we, in the language of anthropologists, hydrocarbon man. We don't just use oil, we are defined by it. From the asphalt beneath our tires, to the plastics in our life-saving medical devices, all the way to the fertilizers that grow the food on our tables, petroleum has permeated every single facet of our biological and economic survival. We are, quite literally, a species running on ancient sunlight.
Today, we are in the midst of a massive, critical transition. There is an aggressive, absolutely vital ambition to shift toward green, renewable energy sources to combat the very real, terrifying environmental consequences of burning fossil fuels. But here is the profound paradox we face: the hydrocarbon reality. Even as we build massive wind turbines and fields of solar panels, the complex industrial logistics, the heavy machinery mining the rare earth metals, and the vast global shipping networks required to construct this new green grid, well, they still fundamentally rest on the assumption of cheap, plentiful oil.
The invisible hand of oil remains ever present in our lives. We see it constantly in how tightly our economic health is tethered to the barrel price. A sudden spike still holds the terrifying power to trigger global recessions. We see it in endless, ongoing geopolitical maneuvering, as nations continue to fiercely safeguard their supply lines. And of course, we see it in the intense environmental scrutiny that shadows the industry, highlighted by catastrophic, heartbreaking disasters like the Exxon Valdez spill. The epic quest Yergin described isn't just locked away in the past. It is actively, intensely shaping our world right this very second.
Which brings us to a really deep, lingering philosophical question. We have engineered our entire civilization, our immense wealth, our geopolitical maps, and all our daily comforts around the combustion of this one specific, finite substance. Knowing how deeply entrenched it is in the very DNA of modern capitalism and global survival, can we ever truly escape the invisible hand of oil? Or are we, as Hydrocarbon Man, just bound to this prize forever?
The end of an era or a new prize. This absolutely forces us to look right at the horizon. As the world shifts its insatiable appetite toward critical minerals, things like lithium, cobalt, and silicon, to power our electric batteries and our massive AI data centers, we really have to ask ourselves, are we witnessing the end of an era or just the birth of a new, maybe even more dangerous prize? Will the resource wars and the tech tycoons of the 21st century end up looking exactly like the oil barons of the 20th? I really want to hear what you think about this. Tell us your perspective down in the comments, and above all, keep questioning the invisible forces that shape our world.